when I think about it now, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching me, lurking in the dark, even when I close all the windows and doors. You can't imagine what it's like, waking up in a cold sweat, feeling like someone is standing right next to you, even though no one touches you. That terrifying sensation, as if you yourself have become part of that shadow. Maybe I shouldn't have agreed to that investigation, but I was too naive and sure of myself. My job is to write reports on the strangest and most mystical events, and I thought I had found the perfect story. It was a small town, quiet, with houses that weren't even on most maps, forgotten by everyone. Exactly the kind of place I love, perfect for a story about forgotten tragedies, about disappearances that no one could explain. The locals spoke of little girls going missing at night, always when the full moon was in the sky, and they said it wasn't just coincidence. Every time they disappeared at the same hour, around midnight, when the town was covered in a dense fog that hid everything around it. I arrived in the town right after another little girl had vanished, and despite the locals' pleas, I decided to do my own investigation. It seemed like nothing unusual at first. All the disappearances happened in the same neighborhood, near an old house that stood on the edge of town. I went there. The road to the house was dark and neglected. The further I walked, the heavier the air seemed to get. The wind grew colder, and the fog thickened, swallowing everything around me. I walked alone, with just my camera in my hands, trying to capture anything that could confirm the locals' suspicions. I was skeptical, but everything changed when I got closer to the house. It was terrifying. Old, with sagging shutters and cracked walls. The windows were boarded up, but through a gap in the wooden frame, a faint light leaked out. It was strange, because I knew for sure that the house had been abandoned for years. The locals said the owners were long gone, and the house stood empty. I approached it, and suddenly I heard something. Soft footsteps. They didn't come from a distance, but from right next to me. I froze. My hands gripped the camera tighter. I turned, but there was no one there. Just the faint light spilling through the crack in the wall. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dampness. I carefully stepped forward, trying not to disturb the silence. My footsteps echoed in the empty house. When I reached the hallway, I saw traces, small footprints on the floor, just like those of a child. I couldn't believe my eyes. This was impossible. No one had lived here for years. Who could have left these marks? I moved forward, following the prints, and soon I found myself in a corner, facing a door that led to the basement. A strange feeling took over me. I didn't know if it was an instinctive sense of danger or something more real, but I decided to open the door. When I descended the stairs, the air grew even colder, and it felt like there was someone down there. I could barely breathe, but I held back my fear because the camera had to capture everything. I kept walking, and soon I noticed a shadow on the wall, barely noticeable. But it moved. It couldn't have been my shadow because I was standing under the dim light, and all I could see was my own reflection. My mind was trying not to accept it as real. I took a few steps forward, and at that moment, I felt someone touch the back of my neck. I instantly turned around, but there was no one there. Only me, my footsteps, and the shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls, growing into dark figures. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A child's laughter coming from somewhere in the corner of the basement. It was laughter, but there was no joy in it. It was empty, like someone was laughing at me, at the fact that I was here, that I had found this house. And that's when I understood. I wasn't alone. Someone was watching me, standing right beside me, with the same shadow stretching behind them. I don't remember how I ran out of the basement. It was like a nightmare. I couldn't stop, couldn't control my movements. My legs were moving faster than I could control. I heard footsteps behind me, as if someone was following me, but every time I turned around, no one was there. The moment I stepped outside, the air seemed lighter, but it didn't end. That little girl's laughter didn't stop in my head. It kept echoing, even when I closed all the windows and doors in my room. I couldn't forget what I had seen and heard. And the scariest part was that with every passing day, that laughter grew louder. It echoed in my head, and I could feel it getting closer. Now I know that this story wasn't just a scary incident. It was a trap. The house wasn't just abandoned. It was the place where not only little girls disappeared, but also anyone who tried to find them. The man who took those children hadn't disappeared. He was here, in this house. He stayed, and now he was waiting for me. Every night, when I wake up in a cold sweat, I hear his footsteps. Soft, almost imperceptible, but they're there. And every time I feel that he's so close, I'm no longer sure that I'll ever be the same again. Maybe I've become part of that shadow now, the shadow that will never leave. I always knew there was something strange about our house, but when I was little, I thought it was just my childhood imagination. Strange sounds at night, rustling in dark corners. It all seemed normal, even though sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was watching me. But one evening, everything changed. I was home alone. Mom and Dad were at work, and I was spending the weekend at our old house in the village. In the evening, when it gets dark, the house becomes especially quiet. The walls seem to creak with the wind, and the windows, which we hadn't cleaned in years, play with strange reflections. But I didn't pay much attention to it until I heard a knock. The knock was coming from under my bed. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sharp, rhythmic knock, as if something was tapping against the wooden boards. I froze. It couldn't have been the wind. It couldn't have been the cat, who might have been playing with something downstairs. This was something else. I got out of bed and slowly approached the bed. I knew something was strange in this house. My mom often said that old houses have their own kind of energy. I didn't know what she meant, but every day I began to feel that this house was not like the others. The knocking grew louder, and I could feel my hands grow cold with fear. I crouched down on the floor and cautiously peered under the bed. At first, I saw nothing, just dust and a few old toys I had long forgotten. But suddenly, something moved in the darkness beneath the bed. I quickly pulled my head back. In the spot that had just been empty, I now saw small, glowing eyes. They were too big for an ordinary animal. I held my breath and stared into the darkness, trying to make sense of what it was. A few seconds later, those eyes disappeared, but the knocking didn't stop. It became more intense, as if something was trying to get out from beneath the bed. I stood up, feeling my heart racing in my chest. Thoughts were racing through my mind. It's just my imagination. It's just a nightmare. But I knew I couldn't just leave it alone. Slowly, as if I didn't want to disturb the silence, I started moving the bed. The more I pushed it, the louder the knocking became. It wasn't just a game. It was something real, something desperate, something that wanted to break free. And then, when I managed to move the bed enough, I saw it. What lay beneath it wasn't like anything alive. It was some kind of shadow, black, formless, stretching out in all directions as if it was a living entity, but it didn't move. It just lay there, hiding its true face. I backed away. My mind kept telling me this isn't real, but when I looked under the bed again, I saw the shadow slowly moving toward me. It moved silently, but I could feel its approach. I bolted for the door and ran out of the room. I knew I needed to leave the house, but something stopped me. I went back, though I couldn't understand why. I couldn't just leave things the way they were. When I returned to the room, the shadow was gone. But when I looked at the floor, I saw black marks. They led directly to the door, and one of them trailed off into the darkness of the hallway. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to return to that room. But when my parents came home, I told them everything. My mom didn't seem surprised and said she had seen those shadows when she was little. Our house has always had its own rules, and sometimes, if you ignore the shadows, they start looking for you. Since then, I never stayed in that house overnight, though I tried to forget what I had seen. But every time I close my eyes, I still hear that knock from under the bed. When I first received the letter, I thought it was some kind of mistake. But the more I delved into what was happening, the creepier each passing day became. It all started when I came back home from the city. Opening the mailbox, I found an old, worn letter. It had a style I hadn't seen in a long time. Handwriting that seemed like it wasn't written by a modern hand, nor a machine. My eyes froze when I saw the envelope. It had one word written on it: help. I immediately thought it was some sort of prank or mistake. I knelt down and opened the envelope. Inside was a sheet of paper with black ink, and it read, "If you are reading this letter, you are already part of the game. Read it to the end if you want to understand what comes next. Otherwise, you will stay here forever." My hands began to tremble. Who could have sent such a letter? And why was it addressed to me? I didn't know what to think, but curiosity took over. I continued reading. "Every night you will hear footsteps. They will get closer, but don't try to catch them. Shadows will follow you, and you'll realize they are closer than you think. When the third day comes, you won't be able to wake up. You will stay with us. Don't try to leave. We know where you are." This letter couldn't be real. I threw it aside and tried to forget. But that night, everything changed. That's when I learned that fear could take such a form. On the third night, right at midnight, I heard footsteps. It was a quiet, barely audible sound, as if someone was sliding across the floor. I thought it could be the cat, but the footsteps grew louder. I got up from my bed, holding my breath. The lamp wasn't on, and the room was as dark as a basement. I quickly opened the door, but the hallway was empty. No cat, no people, just silence that immediately became deafening. The next day, I returned to the letter. I tried to understand what kind of game I had been invited to. It was real. I didn't know how it happened, but I felt like with every step I took in the house, I was becoming a part of this creepy game. The footsteps continued louder and louder. At first, they were heard in the hallway, then right outside the door. I started locking the door, but the footsteps never stopped. That night, I decided to go down to the basement. There was a strange smell coming from below, and when I reached the stairs, I felt something cold, almost tangible, in the air. Slowly, I descended the steps, trying not to make a sound. It was dark down there, but I could have sworn the shadows were moving. I turned on the light and saw something I should never have seen. On the walls were marks, large stains resembling blood, stretched along the walls and disappeared into the darkness. I turned around, and in that instant, the light went out. I was left in complete darkness, and at that moment, the footsteps started again. But this time, they weren't coming from outside. They were right next to me, in the dark. I could feel them getting closer, but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the corner, where it seemed something was standing. I knew it was watching me, but I couldn't make out what it was. I remember feeling as though I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just fear. It was the sensation that something invisible, something inhuman, was already close. I turned the light back on, and at that moment I saw it. On the walls, right in front of me, was a new letter. It was written in the same handwriting, and it had only one word. "You have 3 days left." I jumped and ran back into the house, but as I went upstairs, the footsteps followed me. I stopped, listening to their echoes, and realized I could no longer run away. I decided I needed to find out who was behind all of this. I continued to search the house, but with every step I felt something drawing closer. Soon, I came to a door I had never opened before. It led to the basement, a room with no windows, no light. But when I opened it, I saw something horrifying. In the corner of the room stood silhouettes. There were 2 of them, and they stood as if waiting for me. I froze in place, and then one of the figures moved. In an instant, the door slammed shut, and the house went silent. I will never be able to explain what happened, but ever since then, I hear those footsteps. They follow me in the dark. They are right behind me. And I know I can never escape them.